Hello everyone and welcome to the 5-Minute German A2 course. In today's video, we will learn the concept of relative sentences and relative pronouns, or Relativsatz and Relativpronomen as they are called in German. So this is an important concept in German language, and learning this concept will help you make longer and better sentences which sound more natural. And you can use these sentences in the exam as well as in your daily life. So let's not waste any time and let's get started. So we will start by first of all understanding what is a Relativsatz, which is a relative sentence, and what are relative pronomen or relative pronouns. After that, we will take a look at the relative pronomen in Nominativ, Akkusativ, Dativ, and Genitiv. So we will see how we use relative pronomen in all of these cases. And we will do this by taking a look at a lot of different examples. And along with these examples, we will also do a recap of basic concepts that we learned in A1. Because if you know these concepts, then it will be easier for you to use the relative pronouns correctly. So what is a Relativsatz and relative pronomen? So to understand this, let's take a look at an example. So we have this person who is playing football. So we can describe this by saying, that is the man, he plays football. Now these are two sentences. And we see that the second sentence, which is he plays football, gives us more information about the man. Now when you read these sentences, then you see that the flow is not smooth and it sounds broken. And this is because these are two separate sentences. Now we can write these two sentences in another way, which is, that is the man who plays football. Now this sentence is more smooth and has a better flow because this is one sentence. And there's also a difference that in the first example, we used the personal pronoun he to refer to the man in the first sentence, whereas in the second sentence, we have used who to refer to the man. And this who is a relative pronoun. And you see that it connects the two sentences. And in the second sentence, you also see that the second part, which is who plays football, also gives us more information about the man. So both sentences have the same meaning, but they are written differently. And this part of the sentence, which contains the relative pronoun, is called the Relativsatz. Now let's take a look at another example. So we have the sentence, that is Anna, she works at Siemens. Now you see over here the second sentence also gives us more information about Anna, but this example also has the same problem that it is not smooth and sounds broken because we have two different sentences. Now if we combine them using a relative pronoun, then the sentence will be, that is Anna who works at Siemens. And you see this also has a smooth and better flow. And over here again, who is the relative pronoun which connects both of the sentences, and the part of the sentence which contains the relative pronoun is the Relativsatz. Now let's take one last example. So we have the sentence, that is the car, it is very fast. Now if we want to write this with a relative pronoun, then it will be, that is the car which is very fast. Now in this sentence, since we are talking about a thing, that's why which is the relative pronoun. And the part of the sentence which contains which is also the Relativsatz. So we see that a Relativsatz is a sentence which gives more detail about a person or thing which has been mentioned in the first part. And relative pronomen or relative pronouns are used to connect two sentences. So in the examples earlier, we saw that the relative pronomen in English are who, which is used for people, and which or that, which is used for things or animals. So this was the basic concept of Relativsatz and relative pronomen. Now let's take a look at relative pronomen in German. So in German, the relative pronomen depend upon the gender of the noun in Relativsatz. So if the noun is masculine, then the relative pronoun will be der. For feminine, it will be die. For neutral, it will be das. And for plural, it will be die. And these are the relative pronouns in nominative. So this means that these will be used with the subject of the Relativsatz. And as you know, that subject is the person or thing who does the action. And if you take a look at these relative pronouns, then you will see that these are the same as the definite articles that we have in nominative. So there is no difference. Now let's see how we can use these relative pronouns in sentences with some examples. So we have the example, das ist der Mann, spielt Fußball. That is the man, he plays football. So this is the same example that we saw earlier, but this time in German. Now we can combine them together to form the sentence, das ist der Mann, der Fußball spielt, which means that is the man who plays football. Now in this sentence, you see that there is the relative pronoun. And why have we used there? Because it refers to their Mann. And as you see over here, that Mann is masculine. So that's why we have used the relative pronoun there. And this part of the sentence is the Relativsatz because it contains the relative pronoun. So we can also say that a Relativsatz gives more detail about a person or thing in the Hauptsatz because the first part of the sentence is the Hauptsatz. And one more important point when you use relative pronouns or Relativsatz in German is that you have to add a comma between the Hauptsatz and the Relativsatz. So this is very important. In English, we usually don't use this comma. Now one more thing that you might have seen over here is that in the sentence spielt Fußball, the verb is at the second position. However, when this sentence is written as a Relativsatz, then the verb goes to the last position. So you see that spielt, which is the verb, has gone to the end of the sentence. So we can say that a Relativsatz is a type of Nebensatz because in a Relativsatz, the second position verb goes to the end. Even if it is a normal verb, modal verb, or helping verb, if the verb comes at second position, it will go to the end. And this is similar to the other connectors that we have already learned. So let's just quickly take a look at the other connectors in A2. So we have the connectors in which the verb at second position goes to the end, and these are also called Nebensatz connectors. And here is the list of Nebensatz connectors, which is weil, das, ob, wir-fragen, als, wenn, falls, umso, and damit. And on the right side, we have the connector in which the verb position does not change, and this is only one, which is then in A2. So now we can also add Relativsatz to the list of the connectors in which the verb at second position goes to the end. So we have a total of 11 connectors in A2. Now this overview is important for the exam because if you know what happens to the verb when you use a connector, then you will be able to make correct sentences. Now let's take a look at some more examples with relative pronouns in nominative. So for understanding, let's take the same example, but this time with a feminine noun. So I can say, das ist die Frau, die Fußball spielt. That is the woman who plays football. Now you see over here, I have used the relative pronoun in feminine, which is die, because it is referring to die Frau, which is a feminine noun. Now the same example with a neutral noun will be, das ist das Kind, das Fußball spielt. That is the child who plays football. Now you see that Kind is neutral and it is the one being referred in the Relativsatz. That's why I have used das over here. And an example with a plural noun will be, das sind die Kinder, die Fußball spielen. Those are the children who play football. And you see I have used die over here because it is referring to die Kinder, which is a plural. And you see that in all of these examples, the verb in the Relativsatz goes to the last position. So I hope that now it is clear for you how the relative pronoun is used for different genders. Now let's take some more examples. So I have the sentence, das ist der Tisch, der teuer ist. That is the table which is expensive. Now you see that Tisch ist der Tisch? That's why I have used der as the relative pronoun. An example for the feminine case will be das ist die Nachbarin, die im dritten Stock wohnt. That is the neighbor or female neighbor who lives on the third floor. Now you see that Nachbarin is feminine. That's why I have used die over here. Then we have the example. Das ist das Auto, das sehr schnell ist. That is the car which is very fast. And Auto, as you see, is das Auto. That's why we have used the relative pronoun das in the Relativsatz. And an example for the plural case will be das sind die Studenten, die in Deutschland studieren. Those are the students who study in Germany or who are studying in Germany. So you see, we have used the relative pronoun die over here because it is referring to die Studenten, which is a plural. Now let's take another example. So we have the sentence, das ist das Auto, das Thomas fährt. That is the car which Thomas drives. Now over here, we have again used the relative pronoun das because it is referring to das Auto, which is a neutral. However, an important point over here is that this is not the relative pronoun das in Nominativ. Rather, this is the relative pronoun das in Akkusativ. This is because in the Relativsatz, Auto is the object or in Akkusativ case. So when you write the sentence, then there is no difference because the relative pronoun for neutral in Akkusativ is the same. But before we take a look at some more examples, let's do a recap on how we can find the subject and object in a sentence. So I have already explained this in the A1 course, but I think that this is a good time to do a recap of this concept because if you know how to find the subject and object, then you will have no problem in using the correct relative pronoun. So let's first take a look at how we can find the subject in a sentence. So if you want to find the subject, then you should ask the question who followed by the verb, and this will give you the subject. So in the example that we have above, we see that fährt is the verb in the Relativsatz, which means drives in English. So I can replace the verb with drives over here. So the question becomes who drives? And the answer to this is Thomas. So Thomas will be our subject because he is the one who is performing the action of driving. Now let's take a look at how we can find the object or Akkusativ. So for this, you will ask the question, what does? Then you will add the subject and then you will add the verb. And this will give you the object. Now in the example above, we already know that the subject is Thomas and the verb is drive. So the question becomes, what does Thomas drive? And the answer is das Auto. So Auto is our object or the Akkusativ case. There is also another way in which you can find the object, and that is by asking the question, what is being? And then you add the verb in past tense. So the past tense of drive will be driven. So what is being driven? And the answer is das Auto. So this is how you can find the object in a sentence. And now when we take a look at this example again, then we understand why we have used das in the Akkusativ case. And this is important because the relative pronoun for masculine in Akkusativ is den. So you see that this is different. For feminine, it is the same, so it is die. For neutral, we already saw that it is das. And for plural, it is also the same, which is die. And if you take a look at these relative pronouns, then you will see that these are also the same as definite articles in Akkusativ. Now let's take a look at some examples with relative pronouns in Akkusativ. Let's take an example for the masculine case. So an example can be, das ist der Film, den wir schauen. That is the film which we are watching. Now you see over here we have used the relative pronoun den because it is referring to the film, which is a masculine. And since it is an object in the Relativsatz, that's why we have used the relative pronoun in Akkusativ. An example for the feminine case can be, das ist die Tasche, die sie gekauft hat. That is the bag which she bought. So again, you see that since we are referring to die Tasche. That's why we have used the feminine relative pronoun over here. And you see that in this example, the Relativsatz is written in the perfect form. That's why we have the helping verb, which is hat, at the last position. Let's take an example with the plural case. So we have the sentence, Das sind die Bücher, die ich für meine Prüfung brauche. Those are the books which I need for my exam. And over here you see that the relative pronoun die is referring to the books. Now one important point over here is that when you take a look at this example, then you see that in the Relativsatz we have used the Akkusativ because film is the object. However, if you take a look at the Hauptsatz, then you will see that in the Hauptsatz we have used the Nominativ case, which is their film. And this is because in the Hauptsatz, film is the subject. So remember that for relative pronouns, only focus on the Relativsatz. So if a thing is an object in the Relativsatz, then you will use the relative pronoun in Akkusativ. And if it is a subject, then you will use the relative pronoun in Nominativ. Now we know that one use of Akkusativ is with the object of the Relativsatz, which we have already seen. But we also use the Akkusativ case after accusative prepositions. And these prepositions are durch, für, gegen, ohne, entlang, and bis. So whenever we have these prepositions in the Relativsatz, then we will also use the accusative case. So let's take a few examples with accusative prepositions. So we have the example over here. Das ist der Mann, für den ich arbeite. That is the man for whom I work. And you see that over here I have used den because I have used the preposition für, which is an accusative preposition. And you see that in the Relativsatz, the preposition comes before the relative pronoun. So we have für and then we have the relative pronoun den. Let's take an example for the feminine case. So I have the sentence, das ist die Mannschaft, gegen die wir spielen. That is the team against which we are playing. So die Mannschaft means team, and you will commonly hear the word die Fußballmannschaft, which means the football team. And you see that over here we have used the relative pronoun die because it is referring to a feminine noun. And this is in accusative because we have used the preposition gegen before it. An example for the neutral case will be, das ist das Buch, ohne das ich nicht lernen kann. That is the book without which I cannot learn. So again you see that the preposition comes first and then we have the relative pronoun. And in this sentence, an example for the plural case will be, das sind die Kinder, für die ich Geschenke kaufe. Those are the children for whom I am buying the gifts. So you see that since we have für, which is an accusative preposition, that's why we have used the relative pronoun die to refer to the Kinder. So this is how you will use the relative pronouns in accusative. Now let's take a look at the relative pronouns in dative. So in dative, the relative pronoun for masculine will be dem, for feminine it will be der, for neutral it will be dem, and for plural it will be denen. So you see that the relative pronouns for masculine, feminine, and neutral are the same as definite articles in dative, whereas the relative pronoun for plural is different. And we will use the relative pronouns in dative with indirect objects, with dative verbs, and after dative prepositions. However, out of these three uses, the most used one is after dative prepositions. So we will take a look at this first. So here is a list of all the different dative prepositions that we have in A2. So we have already covered these in an earlier lesson. Now let's take a look at different examples with these dative prepositions. So an example for the masculine case will be, das ist der Mann, mit dem ich arbeite. That is the man with whom I work. So you see, since we have used the dative preposition mit over here, that's why we have used dem, which is the relative pronoun for masculine in dative, to refer to their Mann. Let's take an example with the feminine case. So we have the sentence, das ist die Frau, mit der Frank spricht. That is the woman with whom Frank is speaking. So you see, we have again used the dative preposition mit over here. That's why we will use the relative pronoun der to refer to the Frau in the Hauptsatz. An example with the neutral case will be Das ist das Kind, mit dem ich spiele. That is the child with whom I play. Again, you see we have used the dative preposition mit. That's why the relative pronoun is dem, which is used to refer to das Kind. An example with the plural case will be Das sind die Kollegen, von denen ich viel gelernt habe. Those are the colleagues from whom I learned a lot. So you see we have used the dative preposition von over here. That's why the relative pronoun will also be in dative, which is denen for plural nouns. So this is how you can use the relative pronouns in dative after dative prepositions. Now let's see how we will use these relative pronouns with dative verbs, which are also called Verben mit Dativ. So before we take some examples, let's do a quick recap of what are the Verben mit Dativ. So the Verben mit Dativ can be divided into three major categories. So the first category of verbs which require the dative case are the verbs for giving. So some examples of these verbs are geben, which means to give, bringen, which means to bring, helfen, which means to help, schenken, which means to gift, and schicken, which means to send. So with these verbs, we will use the dative case. The second category of verbs are the verbs for sharing information or feelings. Some examples of these verbs are sagen, which means to say, danken, which means to thank, antworten, which means to answer, gratulieren, which means to congratulate, and empfehlen, which means to recommend. And the third category of verbs are verbs showing belonging or relationship between people and things. So some examples of these verbs are gehören, which means to belong, passen, which means to suit or fit, gleichen, which means to resemble, and fehlen, which means to be missing. Now let's take some examples with these dative verbs. So an example for the masculine case will be Das ist der Mann, dem ich helfe. That is the man who I am helping. Now you see over here we have used the verb helfen, which is a dative verb. That's why we have used the relative pronoun dem to refer to their Mann. An example for the feminine case will be Das ist die Frau, der ich antworte. That is the woman who I am answering. Again you see we have used the verb antworten, which is a dative verb. That's why we have used the relative pronoun der over here. An example for the neutral case will be Das ist das Kind, dem das Spielzeug gehört. That is the child to whom the toy belongs. So over here you see we have used the verb gehören, which is a dative verb and shows belonging. That's why we have used the relative pronoun dem to refer to das Kind. An example for the plural case will be Das sind die Kinder, denen die Geschichte gefällt. Those are the children who like the story. Again, gefallen is a dative verb. That's why we have used the relative pronoun in plural over here. So this is how you can use relative pronouns with dative verbs. Now let's take a look at the last use, which is with indirect objects. But before that, let's do a recap of what is an indirect object. So to understand this, let's take an example. So we have Peter over here and we have his friend Thomas, and we also have a table. So suppose that Peter buys this table for Thomas. Then we can describe this situation by saying Peter buys Thomas a table. Now in this sentence, Peter is the one who is doing the action. So he is the subject and the table is the object. But what is Thomas? So Thomas is the one who benefits from the action because he is the one who got the table. So that's why Thomas is the indirect object. Let's take another example. So I have the sentence, I give the child a book. Now in this sentence, I am the subject and book is the object. And the child is the one who benefits from the action because he or she is the one who receives the book. That's why in this sentence, the child is the indirect object or in dative case. Now let me give you some tips on how to identify the indirect object or dative. The first tip is the one that we already saw, and that is the person who benefits from the action is dative. The second tip is that living beings are usually dative. So normally persons are dative. It is possible that a non-living thing can be dative, but it is not very common. And the third tip is that if you have two objects in a sentence, then the person is usually dative and the thing is usually accusative. So this was a quick recap on how to identify the indirect object or dative in a sentence. And this recap was important because if you identify the indirect object or dative, then you will be able to use the correct relative pronouns in the Relativsatz. Now let's take a look at different examples with indirect objects. So we have the sentence, Das ist der Mann, dem ich ein Buch gebe. That is the man whom I give a book. Now you see that in the Relativsatz, Mann is the indirect object because he is the one who is getting the book. That's why we have used the relative pronoun dem over here. An example with the feminine noun will be, Das ist die Frau, der ich einen Brief schreibe. That is the woman whom I am writing a letter. So since woman is the one who is receiving the letter, so she is the indirect object, or in dative case, that's why we have used der over here. An example with the neutral case will be, Das ist das Kind, dem ich eine Schokolade kaufe. That is the child who I buy a chocolate. Again, you see that das Kind is the indirect object in the Relativsatz. That's why we have used dem. And an example with the plural case will be, Das sind die Kinder, denen ich eine Geschichte erzähle. Those are the children who I tell a story. So you see that in this Relativsatz, the Kinder are in dative. That's why we have used the relative pronoun denen. So this is how you can use the relative pronouns for dative. Now we have already seen different examples with accusative prepositions and dative prepositions. However, there is another type of prepositions which are Wechsel Prepositions. And these are prepositions with which we use the accusative case when there is movement, and we use the dative case when there is no movement. So here are the different Wechsel prepositions that we have in German, and we have already done these in an earlier lesson. Now let's see how we will use these Wechsel prepositions in relative sentences. So let's take an example for the masculine case first. So suppose we have this park and there is this person who goes inside the park. So I can describe this with a Relativsatz as, Das ist der Park, in den ich gehe. That is the park in which I am going. Now since there was movement happening over here, that's why we use the accusative relative pronoun over here, which is den to refer to the park. Now suppose there is another person who is just sitting inside the park, so there is no movement happening. Then I will describe this by saying, Das ist der Park, in dem ich sitze. That is the park in which I am sitting. So you see, we have used the dative relative pronoun over here, dem, to refer to their park, because there was no movement happening. Let's take an example with the feminine case. So we have this wall over here, and we have this person who hangs this picture on the wall. So we can describe this by saying, Das ist die Wand, an die ich das Bild hänge. That is the wall on which I hang the picture. So you see, we have used the accusative relative pronoun over here to refer to die Wand because there was a change of location and there was movement. Now if the picture is already hanging on the wall, then we can describe this by saying, Das ist die Wand, an der das Bild hängt. That is the wall on which the picture is hanging. Now this sentence describes the location and there is no movement happening. That's why we have used the relative pronoun there. Let's take an example with the neutral case. So suppose we have this sofa and there is this person who also has a book and he places this book on the sofa. So there was a change of location and also there was movement. So we can describe this by saying, Das ist das Sofa, auf das ich das Buch lege. That is the sofa on which I place the book. So you see that we have used the relative pronoun thus in accusative over here after the preposition auf, because there was movement which happened. And that's why we also use the verb legen over here, which means to place or to put. Now if we just want to say that the book was lying on the sofa, then we can do this by saying das ist das Sofa, auf dem das Buch liegt. That is the sofa on which the book is lying. So you see, this time after the preposition auf, we have used the dative case, which is dem, to refer to the sofa because we are only describing the location and there is no movement happening. And that's why we have also used the verb liegen, which means to be located or lie. Let's take an example with the plural case. So suppose we have these two chairs and this person places the children on the two chairs. So this can be described in Akkusativ by saying, das sind die Stühle, auf die ich die Kinder setze. Those are the chairs on which I sit the children. So again you see, we have used the relative pronoun in Akkusativ over here after the preposition auf because there was movement happening. And that's why we have also used the verb setzen, which means to sit something. Now since the children are already sitting on the chairs, then we can describe this by saying, das sind die Stühle, auf denen die Kinder sitzen. Those are the chairs on which the children are sitting. Now you see, over here we have used denen, which is the relative pronoun for plural in dative after the preposition auf, because in this sentence there is no movement happening. And the verb sitzen also shows this, as sitzen means to be sitting or to sit. So these were different examples with relative pronouns in dative and different situations in which they are used. Now let's take a look at the last case for relative pronouns, which is the genitive case. Now relative pronouns in genitive is usually a topic for B1, but I have included it over here in A2 because it is not very difficult and follows the same structure as we have seen for the other cases of relative pronouns. So that's why we will take a look at it right now. So the relative pronoun for masculine nouns in genitive is dessen. For feminine nouns it is deren. For neutral nouns it is also dessen. And for plural nouns it is deren. Now you see that the relative pronouns in genitive are different from the definite articles that we have in genitive. And as we have already learned in an earlier lesson, that the genitive is used to show possession or belonging. And all of these relative pronouns in genitive can be translated to whose in English. Now let's see how we can use these genitive relative pronouns in sentences. So we have an example over here. Das ist der Mann, dessen Haus groß ist. That is the man whose house is big. Now you see that the house belongs to the man. That's why we have used the relative pronoun in genitive, which is dessen, to refer to the man. Let's take an example with the feminine noun. So we have the sentence, das ist die Frau, deren Tochter in Berlin wohnt. That is the woman whose daughter lives in Berlin. So you see, we have used the feminine relative pronoun in genitive because we are referring to the Frau. Let's take an example with the neutral case. So we have the sentence, das ist das Kind, dessen Mutter Lehrerin ist. That is the child whose mother is a teacher. Now since the Mutter belongs to das Kind, that's why we have used the relative pronoun dessen over here to show belonging. And an example for the plural case will be, das sind die Eltern, deren Sohn Fußball spielt. Those are the parents whose son plays football. And you see that the relative pronoun deren over here refers to the Eltern. So you see that using the genitive relative pronoun is not so difficult, and it is simply used in place of whose. So if you have a relative sentence in English which contains whose or which shows possession or belonging, then you can use the relative pronouns in genitive. So these are the different relative pronouns that we have in German, and you see that only the relative pronouns in genitive and the relative pronoun for plural in dative is different. The rest are the same as the definite articles that we have in nominative, accusative and dative. And as we saw in different examples, that whenever we use a Relativsatz, then the verb at second position goes to the end. That's why I added it to the table over here so that you have an idea of which connectors shift the verb at second position to the last position. And this table is very important for the exam, so that's why I would suggest that you should take a screenshot of this slide over here so that you can recap it or take a look at it before the exam. And with this, we have completed the topic of Relativsatz and Relativpronomen in German. I know that this was a lot of content that we have covered, but you guys have done an amazing job, and I am sure that now you will have no problem with relative sentences and pronouns because we have covered all the different use cases and situations in which relative sentences and pronouns are used. So I hope that this video was helpful for you. If you have any questions or feedback, please let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for your time, and we will see each other in the next video.